Hi everyone, I'm Benjamin Mack and I am back to go through part 3 of this series. In part 3 we're going to take a look at the sleeve that we've draped and how we can set that in to the armhole of the bodice that we've been working from. So the first thing that we need to do, you need to cut everything out. So press pause, go and cut out the pieces that you need, cut out your sleeve and some muslin or whatever fabric you've got lying around and cut out your bodice. You can just work to half of the body because we're just doing a test run right now. You can see here I've got my half a bodice pinned up on the dress form ready to go, and I have my sleeve also cut out ready to go. Don't forget, it's really important you've got to mark in the notches. We're going to need those because that's what's going to help us to put all of this together. Ideally we want to have some ease in the sleeve cap, and we did factor that in when we were draping the sleeve. For the basic sleeve that we've done, probably about an inch of ease would be enough. If you were doing a tailored sleeve on a jacket or a coat, you'd probably want to have a little bit more ease, and that's something that we can research maybe in future videos. With the pattern, a good thing to do, you can either walk the pattern, so if you have your bodice pattern and your sleeve pattern, you could walk the pattern. That means walking along the stitching line of the pattern pieces. I'm not going to do that right now, but what I am going to do is just a really quick trick to show you what you can do, and it's a very speedy thing. So we're going to measure along the stitching line, so not the edge of my paper here, but the stitching line, or our seam allowance line. We're going to measure from the seam at the underarm all the way across to the seam at the other underarm. And then when we do that, we then want to go and measure our bodice. Maybe the bodice that I've got is already stitched, so I measured this before, so I know what that measurement is. Everyone's going to have something different. We're all working on different size dress forms, different bodices. Everyone's going to have a different number for this. So as we're going along, we want to just, you can use your measuring tape. We're going to measure along that stitching line, trying to be as accurate as possible. And then you keep going all the way along until you get to the other side. And then when you get to the other side, stop at the seam allowance line where the underarm seam is. Take a look at what that number is. Now you'll measure the armhole of your bodice as well, and your sleeve, the length of that line should be a little bit bigger. Like I said, ideally 1 inch. If it's a little bit less than that, that's okay. If it's a little bit more, that's okay as well. It's just the more that there is to ease in, the more tricky this might be. Now for easing in the sleeve, what we're going to do is what's called an ease stitch. Everyone has different ways of doing this. I'm going to show you the way I like to do it. I'll start off by using the longest stitch length on my sewing machine. You could also do your ease stitch by hand. You could just do little kind of running basting stitches, but if you've got a machine to use, then why not use it, right? The first line that I'm going to stitch will be just inside of my seam allowance line. So I don't want it to be right on the seam allowance line, but just inside the seam allowance line. And then I'm going to do a second line parallel to that, about 1/8 of an inch away. So it's important that these two lines don't cross over or meet, because what you want to do by adding in these ease stitch lines, what you want to do, you're creating an area where you can just pull the threads slightly and ease the fabric into the armhole. And by having them 1/8 of an inch apart and running parallel, that's going to create a nice flat area when it comes time to stitching the sleeve into your armhole. So I'm going to start now by beginning. You can start to the front or the back of the sleeve, and you're going to start where your notches are. So I come in and I'm going to make sure I've got the longest stitch here. Now when you're doing an ease stitch, there's two different methods that I've seen before. One is to backstitch at the beginning, but don't backstitch at the end of your line of stitching. And you can do the same for both of the two lines that you're going to do. The other method that I've seen is backstitching at the beginning of your first line that you do, and then backstitching at the end of the second line you do, so that when you pull the threads from opposite ends, that will ease. I find that a little bit more fiddly and more complicated. I think the method I'm going to show you now is a lot easier to do. You may disagree, and you can do whichever method you prefer. We start off with a little bit of a backstitch, and then try, it's fiddly because you're stitching on a curved edge. A curved line is not always easy to manage, but just take it really slowly. You can do it. So just working our way around. And if you need to stop, sometimes if you need to stop, if the fabric's getting a bit bunched up, make sure you put your needle down in the fabric first before lifting the presser foot. Then you can lift the presser foot and just release that fabric a little bit. Put the presser foot back down and then keep going. Okay, so I've reached the notch on the opposite side. I'm going to stop, and remember, I'm not going to do a back stitch when I stop. I did one at the beginning, but not at the end. So I take this out, and it's already starting to ease up a little bit actually, because this is such a fine muslin. So now I'm going to do my second line running parallel to that, and I want to be 1/8 of an inch in for the second line. So line up at the same point that I started before, but 1/8 of an inch in. Put my presser foot down, start with a bit of a back stitch. And then I'm going to work my way around. Now this one's a little bit more fiddly this time, because you want to make sure you don't cross over these lines of stitching, and you don't want them to meet either. They've got to stay parallel to one another. So take your time. And put my needle down, lift the foot just to release the fabric a little. And then when I get to the end, remember, no back stitch. Just pull the fabric out, cut your threads, and we're ready to start to prepare the rest of the sleeve. Now I find doing the E-stitch when the fabric is flat and open a lot easier. So what I'll do next now is to sew the seam together for my sleeve, so then I'll have the finished cylinder of the sleeve, and that's what I'm then going to set into my armhole. Alright, so we're going to bring the two underarm seams together to meet, and we're doing this right sides together. So remember, that's the nice side of the fabric facing the nice side of the fabric. So what we're seeing right now is the inside of our garment. And we added 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm going to start with that. And be sure at this point to change your stitch length back, because we're stitching for real now. This is going to be a permanent line of stitching. So we bring that stitch length back down, and I start with my back stitch. Now you might notice that I'm not using any pins, and that's a bad habit of mine. I tend to just go straight into the machine, but if you're still kind of getting familiar with sewing, or you've got a more kind of beginner level, then I always recommend definitely use pins to keep your fabric together, or otherwise just live on the wild side and just go for it. Okay, so finish with a back stitch. Okay, so that is my sleeve constructed, and I'm going to just trim back some of the threads there. I don't want to trim back the threads that I need for my ease. So you can see I've got a long tail of thread here. I need that to be there because that's what I'm going to use to pull gently and ease the sleeve into the armhole. So my sleeve is all ready. I just snuck out and pressed the seam. I like to press my seams flat and open a lot of the time. Depends on the fabric. This is just a muslin. I probably don't need to take this much detail into account. I've got my bodice here, so I'm going to take this. Now remember, you want to make sure that your notches are marked on the bodice as well. So where we had those marker pins on our armhole, that's where the notch should be. On the front it was 1 mark where the pin is, on the back it was 1 mark where the pin is, and then a 1/2 inch down from that mark. Remember, 1 inch on the front, 2 inches on the back. That's a common rule. So we're going to use those notches to join everything together, and what I'm going to start with is to do everything right sides together. So I'm going to turn my sleeve out the other way, and when I start pinning all of this together, the easiest thing to do, I find, is starting at the underarm seam, or the side seam if you like. So I'll start there, and I'll put some pins in. Then I'm going to go and pin at my notches, making sure that all those loose threads are accessible to me. So I have those notches marked out on my bodice and on my sleeve cap. So I'll pin at those points. Now, theoretically, from the side seam to the notch, it should fit already. If it's not fitting, and it's just like a little bit of a, you just want to kind of jiggle it around a little bit to make it fit, then that's okay. We're trying to just test this sleeve right now. So if we need to bend a little rule here and there, then I'll let you get away with that. Right, so I've got the back notches that I'm lining up now, my double notches at the back. And then eventually the notch that's up on the shoulder, I want that to align with the shoulder seam. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to just pull on my threads, if I can access them. Okay, here we go. I'm going to pull on these threads, my ease stitch. And then as I do that, so I'm pulling both of them together at the same time. As I do that, it's going to start to gather up the fabric a little bit. Now, we're not trying to gather the sleeve, we're trying to shrink the fabric in to fit. That's why it's called easing the sleeve in. So you can start off by just, pulling on a chunk of that and it will look gathered, and then what you're going to do is you're just going to spread that out evenly in between the two notches, front and back. Remembering also that you want to get the shoulder notch aligned also. I'm almost done pinning, just a few more pins to put in, and I've just been easing this in as I go. And I go back and have a look, and it looks like it's fitting in quite nicely. If it seems like there is an area where there's a little bit too much fabric bunching up, then just release the pins and just kind of smooth the fabric out a little bit, just to make sure that it's eased and not gathered. Now we are ready to stitch this sleeve in. So, depending on the type of sewing machine you have, you may have this arm of the machine that you could try to slide this onto. It makes it a little bit easy. If you do that, all of the fabric in the sleeve cap that's all eased in and is a little bit wavy, as you might be able to see by now, you want to be careful that you're not catching bits of fabric and creating big tucks, which is the most common mistake that we see happen all the time in our classes at Mood U Fashion School when we're trying to get people through this process of setting in a sleeve. It's one of those things that's annoying. You've got to unpick everything and start again. So you want to take care with it and just be mindful that you're only stitching through two reasonably flat layers of fabric and not creating any excess kind of big tucks within the seam. The other thing you can do if you find it easier is stitch. It's a little awkward looking, but stitch with the bodice fabric face down and the sleeve fabric face up to you, and at least that way you'll be able to see if the wavy part of the eased fabric is getting caught into the seam or not. So both ways are going to work fine. It's just a matter of taking it slow and being mindful. So I'll go with the second technique that I just told you about. So I line this up. My seam allowance is 1/2 inch, and my stitch length will be a regular stitch length. Starting off with some back stitch. Remember, try to take your pins out as you sew. I know there's a lot of you out there probably that leave the pins in and stitch over them. It's not the best thing to do. You want to make sure that you're not snapping needles when they go down on the pin, and it's just a good habit to get into. Try to remove the pins as you're stitching. Making sure, of course, that I am not forming any tucks in my fabric, whether it be the sleeve cap or the armhole of the bodice. So I finished with the back stitch, and now I'm going to take this out of the machine and go back and check that I don't have any tucks anywhere, which thankfully I don't. It's always the moment of truth when you first take the fabric out of the machine and then see whether or not it worked out the way you wanted it to. Alright, so everything is good. Now, these E-stitches that I had in place, I can pick them out now with my seam ripper. They're no longer required to be there. They've served their purpose. And I'm just going to trim back my other threads as well. Okay, so I'm going to take a minute and just remove my ease stitching, and then I'm going to come back and show you how this turned out, and we'll put it back up on the dress form. So I have pinned my bodice and my set-in sleeve back up on the form, and it came out really good. It's a nice fit. There's a little part here which probably, if I was making this as a real garment, I would go back and fix. I've ended up with a little bit more ease just in one section, which shows what I was trying to avoid. But generally it's a really nice fit. It's got a nice roll over the top of the arm there, the shoulder. And so that's it. That's a set-in sleeve. So we've gone from draping the pattern, transferring it to paper, and now learning how to set it in. So I hope you've enjoyed this series of videos. If there's anything that you specifically would love to learn from us, then pop a note down in the comments and we'll see what we can do for you. All right, take care. Have fun. Bye.